Eyes wide open. Compassionate Conspiracy. With your hosts, Dr. Hans Utter and Kathy Dyer. All right, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Eyes Wide Open on this beautiful Sunday, the 8th of July. Kathy will be joining me here in a bit, but right now I'm going to go ahead and just fly solo and wanted just to talk about some of the issues that are continuing to occur worldwide as we see extreme weather events, we see political unrest, we have media suppression of a variety of major issues, and in fact, arresting people for reporting things. You have the jailing of Tommy Robinson, who I don't necessarily agree with him that much, and he's rather anti-Islam, which the problem really is actually the immigration and population replacement, not Islam per se. But obviously, you're setting up a wonderful arena for more social conflict and social unrest, and at the same time, preventing actual awareness of the causation, the causal mechanisms of these issues. So I wanted to put this in the context of our own individual lives. Each one of us, I assume, is a bipedal human organism. So as a human being, we have a very interesting combination of individual autonomy, which means we can make our own choices. We can choose to relate and have types of social relations. We can also, to a certain extent, guide what we choose to focus on. We can guide our perceptual framework, our perceptual sphere, so to speak, that we operate within. And one of the reasons that these processes of control and understanding of the systems found in cybernetics, which we'll get into here in a bit. I'll break down a little bit more of that quote unquote seance, because I don't know if that is actually a seance recording, but it certainly is a hypnotic audio device, and or audio project, and it's difficult to really follow what's going on. I think that's part of it. But in terms of the fact that things are deployed that influence us, the fact that the financial systems, the methods of achievement, of how success is defined, the breakdown of the traditional relationship structure, families, etc., leaves us in a position where both there is a far greater amount of freedom in terms of choosing identities, in terms of coming up with a new way to be. You can reinvent yourself. And so there could be said to be some positive aspects that we don't have such an overlay of a cultural system that doesn't necessarily allow a lot of light for us to see, right? If you think of someone living in a particular tribe where they are completely bound within that system and therefore are unable to see anything outside of that. Energetically, I think that we can allow ourselves to unfold and to connect with the embodied emotional thought constructs, etc. And that's a way out. But let me go ahead and bring Kathy on. Kathy, are you there? So it does require a degree of inner work for us to sort of transcend or move beyond these issues. So it's not just that you're controlled from outside and you're a helpless slave, but the fact is that it requires inner work, inner development, as well as I think it's important to have awareness of some of these control systems, right? So speaking of that, let's go ahead and bring Kathy on. Kathy, are you with me?
Yeah, I'm here. How are you today?
Oh, good. Doing well. Yeah, everything's going okay. It's a nice, warm, sunny day here in Columbus, Ohio. And yeah, everything's going well. And Kathy, you could probably turn your gain down just a hair on your mic.
Sure, I did that.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. So, Kathy, what did you want to talk about today? Let's talk about the weather. That's a great Midwestern thing to do. You talk about the weather. You talk about the Buckeyes, the football team. So, anyways, it's not really a city per se that people love, but some people like it, and I've realized that there's a lot of strong feelings about Columbus. So, try not to bash Columbus too much because I almost got in trouble yesterday doing that, and people are sensitive. So be it. I mean, you're in Arizona. That's where I was born. So nice open spaces, lots of like dry.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. It's all built up. I
No.
probably would. Well.
Yeah, our city council and mayor have an Agenda 2030 type of mindset and tend to be operating for those types of interests versus the interests of the citizens here who they're supposed to be representing. So a lot of activity going on. And I think that we're seeing this happening throughout the United States. And it seems like much of like what we're talking about with cybernetics, people think that they're going to know things that they don't know. And we've really discovered that here in Scottsdale, where we have this amazing preserve. And unbeknownst to us, the city council and mayor had given a private nonprofit well over $1 million to explore building inside our preserve, building a $75 million desert discovery center that the citizens don't want, but they insist that they have the right to build. So thankfully, there have been a couple of groups that have gotten together and they've raised enough signatures to get it put on the ballot. And it really points to the importance that citizens have got to choose to be aware, because you are not going to know what's going on in the world by listening to television. What do you think about that?
No, absolutely. And this is one of the functions of the social media and the internet is, yes, we're awash with tons of information and you can connect with people you haven't seen for years and years, et cetera. But the fact is, a lot of this stuff goes on the ground in like city council meetings and things like that. This is where decisions are made. And a lot of these organizations can be infiltrated. You have people coming from outside of cities. In England, there's a show, I think it's called Windows on the World, and they talk quite a bit about the Agenda 21, how, like, for example, in terms of creating environmentally friendly cities, they suddenly take out the traffic lanes, they put in these bicycle lanes, and what they're actually doing is creating this massive, traffic overflow. They're kicking people out of buildings, they're re-engineering the cities, and they're actually programming all this stuff, to Agenda 21. I mean, it's ultimately, you're not really going to have any personal property or personal space. You're going to be put into these grids, right? They have this new software now, or new, server type level of stuff that can actually, using face recognition, tying into all the security camera footage, using cell phone pinpoint recognition, basically track and surveil anybody wherever they go. And that is really, the Minority Report is pretty close to being operational. But on the other hand, there still is some resistance, but it is getting pretty serious because I think the entire media has become this just mouthpiece. It's gone so far over the top that, it's completely a mind control propaganda matrix, and it absolutely ignores the issues that are going on, but on the local level, when you see like zoning stuff, an example, here in Columbus, there's like this move to destroy all these old buildings, right? I was just in Charlottesville, which is a wonderful city in Virginia, a beautiful, really beautiful place, and I saw these old statues with the ticker tape around it, or what do you call it, like the crime scene tape, because they're going to destroy these beautiful statues. Well, here's the thing. Well, beautiful or not, right? First of all, you have like Robert E. Lee. Guess what? Robert E. Lee never owned slaves. He was not pro-slavery, right? And so there's a lot of misunderstandings about that. But number two, these issues are really about the erasure of the past, the erasure of any kind of historical sense and heritage. And that goes from destroying buildings, and you see what's being put up. A lot of times it's like you're entering the same city. It reminds me just like, you go to a really big airport.
It's the McDonaldization of the world. And, the other thing that you're talking about that's super important, it's just not erasing the architecture and all of that, but it's disconnecting us too from our families. And so we don't have this lineage anymore. We don't know where we come from. We don't know who we are. So we're these parts that just can be replaced. It's like machines, right? You have an issue on your computer, you trade out a part and you get it fixed. Pretty soon they'll tell you can have a cybernetic transhuman mind, and they can put a chip in and expand your memory, because to them, everything is about information. And that's what cybernetics is about, information society. But when you're in an information society and you don't understand the information, then you're really at a disadvantage.
Well, also, as it says in Sister Marian Joseph's book, the trivium, I think I pronounced that, or I said the right name. So the trivium, one thing she says that's very important is that facts without any type of analysis or understanding actually prevent knowledge. They actually operate to remove the real understanding. And so the information, first of all, information is great, but is everything really based on information? Now, obviously, when they're talking about information, they're talking about sensory input. They're talking about all these other types of information that are going into the black box, right, into the brain. But the result is that you have all these disconnected streams, and I think it can serve to disconnect you from your actual present existence and your life and your lifespan. And what does that mean? And as I mentioned in the beginning, Kathy, I don't think you heard it. I mentioned that, we do have sort of an unparalleled freedom in that we can create new identities. We have this sort of fluidity that's not entirely bad. And I use the example, for the listeners, I'm just repeating it, but hey, you get to hear it again. So like say you live in a tribe, right? And this tribe can have very, very completely controlled system that just functions almost by itself. And you're inside of that. You really can't, you're not even able to know anything else exists outside of it. Sometimes these can be very positive situations, sometimes not. But and in terms of speaking of tribes, let's look at the tattooing and body piercing, which is something that was, obviously connected with, a tribal type of a culture, but these permanent alterations to the physical body. I mean, I see so many guys that are in their 40s now that are just covered in tattoos. And I'm like, there's so many people that are, when you do a tattoo, it's permanent. You cannot remove that. You're modifying your body, and with the piercings and all.
Kind of a form of transgenderism, if you think about it, right? If I reflect on what you're saying right now, it makes me think about this whole thing that you and I've talked before about transgenderism, and people modifying themselves in such ways without even really understanding what they're doing. I mean, how many people understand the meaning of the symbols that they're tattooing themselves with? And then you're right, they're irreversible, kind of in the way that if I chose to be a boy and have this, surgery done, I can't really change it. But do I really understand what I'm doing?
Yeah. Well, there's this thing of the, rite of passage and all these kinds of things. And, again, you look at, if you have a functioning system, right, you have these thresholds in life, you have these gateways to different new types of identities and being. And if you have, you can look at like the Bushmen actually have a very harmonious society. Now it's obviously not technologically advanced, but they have, a very cohesive society, and people there may be truly happy or far more happy than we are. Now, can you go back? Can we go back and live in that kind of society? No. The second thing is these things are just randomly pulled like a hodgepodge. And so there's this idea of this masochism where you're inflicting pain on yourself. You get these tattoos, they're permanent. And I listened to something the other day about tattooing, saying that it's actually connected sometimes with demonic possession. So actually when you get your body, you get certain types of tattoos actually are believed to be sort of allowing for types of energetic
a portal. You're opening up an energetic portal. And the same thing that when you're wearing brands. And this is like this whole ties back into this whole thing on cybernetics semiotics, is that when you wear certain brands, you're opening yourself up as a let's just go out there a little bit on the side outside of conventional way that people believe. But it's said that if you're doing this, you're opening yourself up to the energy that resides or is that symbol or is that sigil.
Yeah, and so we have the sigil magic too, and these symbolic stuff. I think we've seen this video, which I don't recall who did it, but they break down even like these video bumpers for news shows, and there's so many little things going on there, and you have all these flashing lights and these symbols and this sense, and it's kind of become the standard for professional production, right? You have just tons of things going on and flashing lights and weird graphics coming in and out, and then of course you have the ticker tape of the daily events. So it just creates this kind of overloaded and distracted environment where these things are subconsciously connected with, because we, as we've talked about the reticular activating system a little bit, which we'll probably go into more detail, but reticular activating system, you're not going to see this stuff. You're not going to attend to it. And a lot of times, like, there's a discomfort, right? I had someone, when I was performing, I mentioned, they got a very powerful experience with my music, but this lady, she said that there's certain music I can't listen to. She's very sensitive to energy and stuff, and said there's so much energy in this music that I can feel it doing things to my body. I can feel what it's doing to me, how it's, it's affecting me energetically, how it's almost, interjecting into the body mind, arena. And a lot of the stuff is unconscious. But what I want to mention is that certain things like that, when if you haven't watched TV for a long time and you turn on the TV, you may have like a little bit like, wow, this is making me feel weird. But guess what we do? We shut down those signals. Like they mentioned that, what was it about intuition, right? The intuition is completely wrong. Well, there's an intuition. There is the sense that, this is our mechanism. This is how we function, is we have to have these levels of awareness. And part of that is these emotional signals that we get. Now, can these be distorted? Absolutely. But I think part of it, as I've mentioned many times, it's like, the first time someone has a cigarette or takes alcohol or even drinks coffee, he's like, man, this is gross. But you get over that discomfort. And then next thing you know, your mind adjusts to it. And that's one thing.
Become habituated.
Yeah, and we're so flexible, right? If you have a certain level of discomfort, right, you can get used to living in really constricted environments, and you will adjust even in a matter of days or weeks. You can't,
and you're not even aware that you're adjusting. So here's the insidious thing about it: is you begin adjusting to your environment, and you're not even aware that you're doing it. It's just, it happens. It's just like I'm breathing without having to think about it. My heart's beating in the same way when I'm put in a different type of environment that's constrictive, especially if I'm told it's not. So here's the other thing that's going on, is that people are being sold. So I'm going to jump back with what you were talking about before with Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and the re-engineering of cities and the creation of what they call these smart cities, where you're right, you're not going to own anything. You're going to live in your tiny apartment or your tiny house, which is why they're promoting the whole tiny house thing so much. And you're not going to own anything. Have you seen all these bikes around, Hans? I don't know if you have them in Columbus, but they're parked. You swipe your credit card and you can ride the bike wherever you want.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, it's almost like having a responsibility-free life. I show up at work, hey, and I can just change my jobs. Everything's going to be all virtual, But what strikes me is, where's the meaning? It's really focusing on the human as a machine and getting humans to adapt to machine life. But where's meaning in life?
Well, no, exactly. Meaning and not only meaning, but the experience, right? It's like we sever ourselves from our connections with the natural world, with our own experience, don't even know what actual deep bonds or connections are like, and you know how important they are. And then we also are put into situations where we, you know, you adjust and you constantly adjust, and a lot of people don't even know that they're in a prison. And so just Kathy, just say something real quick here because I got the clip coming up from the cybernetics video. So go ahead.
I think what you just said is really important because it ties into something, you know, I'm very passionate about, which is attachment. And as we break down the family and aren't these deep connections between, you know, parents and their children or mothers and their children, you can't have what you don't know. And if you don't experience these types of relationship as a child, you're left wanting and needing, knowing that there's something more, but not really being able to grasp it because we don't really have a language for it in our society. And if there's really not a language for it, then people have a hard time articulating it. You'll hear people say, I just can't find the words. But look at what we have words for. We've got words for PC, we've got words for tolerance, we've got words for transgender. We've got plenty of language that's being offered to us to bring in this mechanistic system, but not a very good language for our emotional lives, for connections, for things that really bring meaning to us.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and listen to this first clip from the supposed cybernetic seance. Here it goes.
Trade this knowledge of the division of or culture homogeneous groups. The either modifications appropriate for search can we then it may not be able to provide measures which will changes other without.
Okay, so that's the very first clip, and I know it's very hard to hear, but what you have is you have two clips that are playing back to back, right? They're superimposed. One of them is the of tree of knowledge, so cybernetics is the bite in the tree of knowledge. And the other one is that we will understand and be able to understand the mechanisms of society and even change, proscribe types of behavior or even types of perception and thought. So right there, they're saying that with cybernetics, they are able to rewire social systems. And in fact, I think what's being implied there is that they will be able to render invisible, to render incomprehensible that there ever was even a type of freedom, right? There was, or there's another way of being or living, but they're talking about essentially the deep structural manipulation of society. But again, this is such a weird little video, right? Because you don't even know the provenance of these audio clips, and then the way it's produced and the way it's deployed that we listen to it, it's quite odd, right? It's quite weird. And so, like I said, we'll get into that. But basically, he's saying that, again, the bite of the tree of knowledge, cybernetics is the greatest, it being played with the same time of the text about understanding the functioning systems of society and be able to proscribe behavior, proscribe thought, and things like that. So, Kathy, what do you think of that?
Well, it's very important because Burton Laffey speaks about this in Robots, Men, and Machines, or Robots, Minds, and Machines. And he talks about Juice Merlot, who speaks about menticide. And I have this quote of his, and he says that in the end, the effects of modern psychotechniques and behavioral engineering amount to functional decerebralization. That is the exclusion of higher cerebral centers and mental faculties almost as efficiently as if these were removed by surgical operation. Then the behavior of rats, cats, and the mentally defective can indeed serve as the model of human behavior. Not even the threat of atomic annihilation can change the ways of a manipulated humanity, which are almost as strongly ingrained as the instinctive urge of a herd of lemmings, leading them irresistibly into self-destruction. In mentalistic terms, the same may be termed menticide, a procedure actually more effective and irrevocable than clumsy attempts at genocide. For thanks to the regenerative processes of nature, genocide, at least up till now, has proved to be rather ineffective. Extermination of millions did not destroy the races and peoples concerned, but was quickly followed by replacement and even population explosion. Menticide, in contrast, is highly successful and irreversible. If a population is manipulated in the right ways, it cannot transmit to coming generations values and freedom it has lost itself. And this is precisely what psychological manipulation aims at and has been widely achieved.
Well, that's a great quote, because that is kind of the process that's going on, right? And so,
Kind of.
well, yeah, okay, it is. It is a process that's going on, right? And you have so menticide. Now there is. It's not the case. Cultures have been lost, right? Things have been erased and wiped out. But the thing is that, yeah, it's very difficult necessarily to physically annihilate an entire group or a race. But if you start with the mind, then in fact, that's what's going on with this immigration stuff. I'll give you an example. In Germany, this migrant beheaded a baby, cut the head off a baby, and murdered it was like his girlfriend or ex-wife, and he wanted custody of the child, and this was filmed. Some guy filmed it. Guess what happened? That guy, the videos were removed from YouTube, and the guy was put in jail for posting that because it generates negative feeling towards migrants. So now, are they migrants? No, these technically they're invaders, but again, we get in this PC territory. Well, you talk about that, you don't have compassion. Well, no, how are these people chosen? These people are being brought in by huge networks of NGOs that are operating, in very shady types of things, and are also getting money from smugglers. But you're bringing in people, probably they're maybe even be selecting for some of these people that are psychotic. I'm sure, like I said, even if you took a bunch of psychotic, sociopathic people from the United States and started pumping them into another culture, then, you might have similar results. But the menticide is that you can't even see it. You can't talk about it, and it's allowed. And yet you perceive this as we're doing something good. You see the Swedes. I mean, right now the Swedes, they have this, I forget the number of people, but they're getting these chips implanted in their bodies. So they don't have to, they're like they can swipe the credit card. They can enter their apartment. They can drive their car because they have a chip, and there's like, oh, it's so convenient. So they're already doing that. They're rolling these things out already.
But there's another thing that's important too, Hans, about the whole thing on immigration. And people say, well, that's what America was built on. But you look at the types of immigration that the United States experienced in the early 1900s compared to the type of immigration that's happening today. And this is going to sound so politically incorrect, but there's a lot of media around it that a lot of the people coming in don't have the skills. They can't read and write in their own language, let alone ours. They lack the skills, and they oftentimes have had issues with malnutrition and things of this nature, which really affect the development of the brain. So these people coming in are very, very different. It's demanding a lot, and it really plays on people's emotions and saying, well, we should be here to help everybody. That's what America's built on. But they're not fully understanding the big picture and what they're saying. And so they're making these conclusions based on incomplete information. They're not understanding what it's really doing.
Yeah. And okay, let's just keep being on PC. I know some people may not like this topic, but the reality is, okay, look, I've lived all over the world. I would consider myself to be very open to other cultures and very respectful for other cultures. But when you look at, say, the United States, well, who actually built the country? Now, I don't. Now, it is what happened to Native Americans. That is, it is a terrible thing, and in no way justifying that. But the actual system that's built up that we see today was built by primarily English, Germans, and other Europeans, right? That was how this country was built by and large. Now, you did have laborers, for example, in Toronto, I think it's Vancouver, or BC, British Columbia, you have these Chinese that were, brought in to work on the railroads. Well, now they're claiming that they own the territory. They're actually taking over almost entire cities and entire universities. Well, do they allow that in China? Hell no. You in China, you good luck becoming a citizen. All these things. It's only us in the West that is allowing this, and there's also this sort of Christian morality that's deployed, and say, oh, you feel guilty. So this is just one example, I think, of the process of menticide coupled with the actual replacement and destruction of the existing cultural forms, because what you get is you have all these groups now, and I think that it's nice, there's an important ebb and flow between systems, there's between cultures, right? You have a certain number of immigrants, right? But when you have this mass immigration of populations that are just coming in en masse by the tens of thousands, and you have people coming from, say, the Sudan, right, where they've been at war for decades, where you just rape people. I mean, it's been war torn, but people are in an incredibly violent culture. You're just dropping them into the heart of Europe, and then you can't even discuss it. It's blocked from discourse. You can't even bring it up. And then when you do, you have, for example, the videos of the mothers getting taken away from their children. Well, okay, but guess what? Like I said, if I try to sneak into China, I'll probably get my head cut off, or Singapore, or whatever,
or Iran. Hey, and let's talk about also what's happening in Israel right now. They're paying African migrants to leave. And if they don't leave, they're going to be arrested. So here's the other thing that brings up cognitive dissonance for people. Because the narratives are so artfully crafted, right? It's mind control. To really accept what's happening in the United States means that you are consuming mind control if you don't question what's happening. If you don't question what's happening now in the United States, you're not really fully understanding what's happening in the world. Especially like, could you or I go to Iran? No. Could we go to China? No. North Korea? No. And now we have Israel that is paying to get rid of people that immigrated there. Hello,
and
what's
guess where
going
they're
on?
sending them? United States, Canada, and Europe. They're not sending them back to Africa. And but there's issues. And again, if you have a functioning society, why not make societies function, right? So this whole idea of diversity, well, what you're doing is erasing diversity, right? And this goes back to the Kalergi plan, where, you want to sort of get rid of all distinctions between people. And you want to remove gender and roles. And you really, it's really going towards this, like we talked about last week, with this, all this fluidity. Well, you're actually destroying diversity.
Well, justice warriors.
Diversity is being destroyed. You're annihilating. When you go into Charlottesville and you tear down statues, you're actually destroying the diversity of that unique culture and heritage that's there. You're not really increasing diversity. It's only a certain type of diversity that's permissible. It is not so that word itself, it doesn't make sense, because if you just look at nature, right, now I'm not into this whole thing of like, okay, we have to have this segregation of populations, but look, there's absolutely a war that is being conducted to destroy, by and large, one of the major forces in developing the quote unquote modern world. And then, what do you have? That's a good question. But anyways, going back to menticide, there's so many other ways you can see that, that one of the reasons, things is, like, for example, the use of drugs, as it's shown on television and movies, they've shown that actually increases, greatly increases people wanting to take drugs, right? So you have this identification. You even go back as early as, I think it's Gordon Allport, writing about the radio in the 30s, and he talks about that the father figure is in the 30s, saying the father figure is already gone from the family. There's no more, there's no more respect for, family or tradition. And so we're replacing it. And they studied that quite a bit, of how hearing that voice of, say, FDR, who was, how to make him connect with people and make him become this figure of authority, this authorial voice, right? This position of the wise king, the wise father, at the same time removing or pushing back on the family, right? I mean, we go into like how in all these television shows and movies, like how a lot of men are portrayed as absolutely incompetent. And well, I'll just stop there. Go ahead.
It's interesting, as I'm listening to you, I think about words again, and how in cybernetic terms, positive means negative, communication means anti-communication. And when you said the word diversity, I opened up this article I have on cybernetic readings. And it reminds me of Boaz also, who believes in this whole thing of egalitarianism, that, we're all the same. It reminds me of Kurt Vonnegut's book, Harrison Bergeron, where people are handicapped. Like if a woman is too pretty, she has to wear a mask. If you're too smart, you have to wear an electric device on your head that buzzes you every few minutes. So everybody's completely equal. And is it, I'm going to butcher his name and you can help me with it. Humberto Maturana, who's also very big in cybernetics, says, talks about the notion of diversity. And he says, men are genetically equivalent to the extent that they belong to the same species. And all human diversity is either due to genetic variability within this fundamental equivalence or to upbringing. And it says cultural and physical environmental differences during ontogeny, or both. And so it really makes me wonder, like, when we talk about diversity, what are they really meaning about it? And what are we driving towards? Does diversity mean everybody has to be the same? As diversity conformity?
Well, yeah, that's exactly. I mean, it's not only that. That's what Kalergi talks about. He's right. All the races will disappear, and they'll just be left with, like the ancient Egyptians. All cultures and races and differences will breed together, and we'll just have this sort of homogenized being like the ancient Egyptians, which is a direct, but paraphrase quote. So diversity actually means the destruction of diversity, because if you don't have a mechanism of preservation, and if you don't have a transmission of these cultural practices, and I'm not genetics, I'm not quite, I don't want to get into that, but I mean, there certainly are some traits, right? If you have, families of artists or musicians or people that are good at certain things, it can be passed down to your kids, or if someone, even if you have someone who's an alcoholic, that can maybe also influence coming generations. So there's a major disconnect, but I think that's very similar to what you find in a lot of this cybernetic stuff, where you're required to take on major metaphysical assumptions that are not clearly outlined, but they're presented as factual and as necessary and as real. And also in the case of, for example, this idea of this new society, the new social order that's being promoted and promulgated, is that of you're doing something positive. You're removing this horrible, culture of war and violence and and this is the only way we'll survive, is by, we have to take these choices, to save ourselves, blah, blah, blah. But it means actually the annihilation of diversity. So it means the exact opposite. Right. And it's not for everybody, though. Right. These the people in the pulling the strings, they're not egalitarian. They see themselves clearly as superior.
Well, and what we're really seeing is that this is really a religion that's being sold in the form of science, and it's being executed through social policy. And people don't really understand, just like the way that Piaget was not forthright about the monad and what he was speaking about, which is really about religion, his religion. He obfuscated the meanings of words, so anybody reading it would think one thing. And actually, most people don't read Piaget. They read interpretations that others have made of Piaget. But what we're discovering is that the same thing's happening in a lot of other areas in what's deemed science, like in psychology and anthropology, and that these so-called sciences are really being used to promote religious beliefs in the form of science and social policy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let me go ahead and play another clip here from that cybernetics seance, which is just interesting, again, because of the audio that's there. So here we go. Next clip.
Years 2000, last being taken as mankind, that knowledge of tree, the of fruit, the of out, bite, biggest, the is cybernetics.
So there we have, the year is 2000. They start out with the year is 2000, and this is one of the clips that's played in the background, right? But in this case, it's foregrounded, and the of tree of the bite biggest of that, of knowledge. And so this
makes no sense. It's like you listen to it. I transcribed it. You're right. It says years 2000 last, in taken as mankind, that knowledge of tree, the of fruit, the of out but biggest is the cybernetics. What?
So yeah, well, just read that first little bit of that, the first sentence about the year 2000.
It says years 2000 last, in taken as mankind.
Okay. So hold on. So there's some word order scrambling, right? So years 2000 intaken as mankind. The last 2000 years, the intake of mankind, right? In the last 2000 years. So they're reversing word order, as well as splitting meanings. But so in the last 2000 years, so this is saying in 2000 years of human culture, and then read the next part.
That knowledge of tree.
Okay, that knowledge of tree. So
Tree of knowledge.
yeah, so that's a tree of knowledge, right? That's a tree of life. That is, there's obviously the pretty odd, well, very obvious biblical reference, right? The fruit of the tree of knowledge, that's being referenced, but the of tree, that's it's an interesting construction. It doesn't make sense consciously, but that's why I'm wondering if in a certain point, if we do another type of analysis to see if there's a type of hypnotic induction being conducted through that. But, you know, the surface level is that the of, now notice of, the way this word of is being accented, of, tree. And, you know, read the last part. Go ahead.
The of fruit, the of out but biggest is cybernetics.
The of out but biggest. The of.
The
So-
of out but biggest.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, what on a simple level, what they're saying in the last 2,000 years, the greatest bite that mankind has taken out of the fruit of the tree of knowledge is cybernetics. But why is it being said in this extremely weird way, right? With all these predicates, and so it's like encoded, but there's also some type, I think, of a symbolic reference. And I think we would want to look at these like and or of, you know, and these, what these actually prepositions mean and what they mean for cybernetics, right? Because these prepositions are relational structures of meaning, of action, of agency, and also even of cognition. So I think that that's important to look into. And let me just go ahead here. I'm going to play another.
Can I just say one thing real
Oh,
quick?
absolutely. Go ahead.
Sorry. When I think of the tree of knowledge, I think of the Kabbalah. And I think about Talmudic reasoning and Talmudic rules of engagement, which is actually where a big part of what Panjaro spoke about last week comes from. His conversation theory emanates from all of this. And again, it's about the use of words. And so to us, you know, it's like it doesn't really seem to make sense, but obviously it does make sense. And so then how do all of these things connect back? Because good luck trying to understand the Kabbalah. It's passed down verbally. You know, it's an oral tradition. Yes, you can learn about it, but you're not going to get the nuances of it. So it's like, I give you a recipe. Okay, I'll share with you. My mom gives me her German cheesecake recipe. And for years, she left this one ingredient out and I'd make it. And I'm like, it never turns out right. After 5 years, she's like, well, about 13 minutes in, Cassie, did you put the foil on the top? And I'm like, no, Mom, you never mentioned that. I did. And it turned out fine.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well,
But it's the same thing.
No, it really is. And well, one thing, the Kabbalah, you know, this is ancient knowledge, right? This is not something that, you know, now it's associated, you know, primarily with, you know, Jewish practices, but it actually goes back Chaldean and things like that. So we have to go back. It's very ancient type of knowledge. It is something that does have a great deal of power or potential power. But you're absolutely right, is that even if you look at, say, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and their type of, that's based on Kabbalah. A lot of the magic from black magic, white magic, all that stuff was preserved and actually, you know, was part of this Kabbalah. And it is a connection with numbers and words are of primary importance, and numbers, and even we could look at these words. What are the numbers of those words, right? There's this whole mysticism of numbers, which ties directly into this, you know, computer science, and there's all kinds of systems and structures. And I had this book that I glanced at, which I want to get into more about, all these types of number series and number organizations. And so there's a huge array of both the symbolic consciousness of man, but also the effects that this has. And at the same time, as a power, as a system of power that is able to invoke and to create types of changes or situations, or perhaps even cast a spell over the world. And if you look at, say, for example, a lot of these orders, right? There is some, so you have to go back to even the 1920s or earlier to look at the analysis of some of these type of occult organizations, where you go through all these stages. This is all for the best, like Masonry. You're going to help people, and I think a lot of people involved in Mason, that are Masons, are very positive, right? They don't know that much, but in the higher stage, basically you're submitting, and according to one author, that actually there is a disembodied communication that is sent to the person once they have sort of opened their mind up, and they will become almost controlled by this disembodied sort of communication network that exists around the world, sort of a mind level communication where they'll hear voices, etc. And this is written obviously before voice to skull technology. This book, I think it was written in the 20s. And so now that's a little bit far out, but notice that there's a process of initiation where as you get into it, once you reach that final stage, you can't back out. You may actually end up as someone who is controlled externally by this organization. When you connect with the masters, and according to this author, I'll get that citation later, the masters are actually not disembodied spiritual beings. They're actually human beings that are able to use this type of telepathic communication, so to speak. And but when people think that they're these gods or whatever higher beings, they're actually not. And so these types of initiation and induction ceremonies, I think, are very important to understand, right? And I think that we found out about this aspect of cybernetics because that was, I think we mentioned the sort of the origin of this, right? Was just you're reading a text, and I said this doesn't sound just like science. This sounds like some kind of mystical system, which it turns out. Guess what? It appears that there is that component there that is very strongly regulated. And how about that plaque I sent you? That I don't know if we can. Maybe I'll show it.
The cybernetic.
Yeah, isn't that wild? I mean, it's crazy. But it is this worship of the machine, right? It is this.
Well, it's the golem. And interestingly enough, on that, it shows on that metal. It refers to God and golem, and so you have to wonder: is technology a form of a golem?
Well, or else is, there's a lot of things in that Wiener book, right, that he says that are double meanings. He also goes through a bunch of narratives and stories, like parables and legends and things like that. But if you read it carefully, it's very clear. In a certain way, he's saying, look, we are conducting this kind of occult ceremony that is raising us now beyond the level of mortal man to the part of godhood, but yet the golem that's created is I was actually reading something about the golem, because actually when the golem was made, the golem went berserk and started killing people. It started killing the wrong. It just basically went nuts, right? So that story in the rabbi in Prague, right? So the golem went nuts, and so he had to make the golem die because the golem. Well, what's Frankenstein? Frankenstein's monster, Mary Shelley. That is absolutely about that golem. But in this case, it's framed as a positive venture. But notice the fact that you're creating a type of self-reproducing slave system. And in fact, the machine is being posited as God, not only the creator of the machine, but the machine itself. You're sort of doing that. So, okay, let's listen to one more clip here from that wonderful ceremony. So here it goes.
Measures prescribed to enable knowledge of the conditions which obtain in homogeneous one intergroup shall be in a position to examine the process of fusion of processes to be examined. We may even be able to prescribe measures which will either promote shall be such groups homogeneous predict in the state which conditions of knowledge.
Okay, so that clip, right? That clip is really interesting because we still have that tree of knowledge going on in the background, right? And that's right in the beginning. I don't know if you transcribed that, where he talks about the promotion within homogenous groups. And in the back.
Yes, I do have it.
Okay, yeah.
It says, with this knowledge of the conditions which obtain in homogeneous groups, we shall be in position to examine the processes of fusion of two diverse groups into one.
Wow,
We
look at
may-
that. Look at that. So this is very important, right? You look at
Oh, yeah.
homogeneous groups fusing the two into one. Now, what groups are we talking about? Are we talking about social structures, social orders? Are we talking about man and machine? Well, keep going.
Two different. We may even be able to prescribe measures which will either promote or retard such fusion and predict which will wait. I'm sorry. Hold on. I can't even read my own handwriting. We should be able to prescribe measures which will either promote or retard such fusion and predict. It's, I think, a trait which fits the 5 aspects of energy.
The 5 aspects of energy. So predict a trait. Okay, so notice this is talking about very high level, absolute social engineering. Now, what are the 5 types of energy? That's quite interesting. That sounds like something out of alchemy, not out of
Well,
science.
it reminds me, yeah, and it also yes, and it also reminds me of the cybernetic big 5 personality traits. So it's interesting. It says we will be able to predict that trait which fits the 5 aspects of energy and can be added to a culture without other changes. If it does not fit, then we can search for appropriate modifications at either the culture or aspects by the fits with which trait that predict and fusion such retard or promote either which will measures prescribed. I mean, it's, and I thought, am I really reading? I went back and transcribed it 3 times to make sure that I was capturing the words properly. And I'm sitting here thinking, what does this even mean?
Well, I think it means a lot. Well, first of all, the 5 types of energy, right? I just looked it up, and it says that we have, gravitational. Okay, energy comes in 2 basic forms: potential and kinetic. Potential energy, chemical, nuclear, gravitational, thermal energy. I don't think that's what they're talking about, because they're talking about homogeneous groups and societies. So I think that, we look at these types of causal chains, right? And how these are included. So I think that these 5 types of energy, that's another thing I think we should actually look into, because it, he's taking it as obviously, you're talking about a society. You're not talking about nuclear energy. You're talking, and basically there's technically 2 types of energy, which is kinetic and potential. So what are the 5 types of energy they're referring to? Maybe you want to mention the 5 types of the relational model you brought up?
Yeah, the cybernetic big 5. It goes into trait hierarchies of stability and plasticity. And so under stability, there's neuroticism, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And then under plasticity, extroversion and openness, which is also known as intellect. And so what they know, and this is really a lot of Jordan Peterson's work is based on the cybernetic big 5. He talks a lot about this. He has a whole series that are available on his lectures online about, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness. And conscientiousness is really very important. He spends a lot of time in that domain. It goes into the aspects of industrialness and orderliness. So each one of these domains, these big 5 domains, also has aspects within them. And the reason I found it is I was doing research on attachment theory and cybernetics, and I found this article on the cybernetic big 5 theory and attachment. And I started reading it and thinking, my gosh, there's so much that they understand when you think about cybernetics meaning to steer. Or as Timothy Leary would like to refer to it as piloting. We're being steered, but are we aware? Do we know where we're going? Who's piloting us? That's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah.
And it ties in also to the cybernetic cycle, okay, which we talked about before, which ties into cybernetic goal seeking activities. And then the actions and the strategies you pick, how you're interpreting, how you're doing, if you're using negative feedback, which is good, or if you're using positive feedback, which will lead to no change. And if you're achieving your goal or not. I mean, it's so complex. And I discovered this whole thing ties into the type of work I do, which is around emotional intelligence and self-regulation. It's so, to me, overwhelming. And I had absolutely no idea. I mean, I'm a curious person, but I had no idea until recently that how much of our world is based in cybernetics and cybernetic language, and we have no awareness of it. We don't make those connections. We're not taught that. Nobody teaches you this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so it's interesting that this did come out of systems theory, which, we were talking about electrical devices, you're talking about factory control systems, where it does absolutely make sense. It makes a lot of sense. You have these negative feedback loops. It actually was used for like control of amplification, for like at Bell Telephone. And so, but then how did this go into this entire model of control of society, right? But we have the idea of these teleological mechanisms, right? So this idea of this goal setting, corrective feedback, and James Watt, as we mentioned, so it is James Watt with the steam engine and the governor, which is you have a machine set for a goal with an inbuilt corrective self-regulation, right? Now, how does this go to the human being and the mind, right? And the control of the mind, and how do you take something as immensely complicated as the human brain and human society and apply this really, it's a binary sort of a simple model. Well, that's kind of what we're doing here, right? So, but it definitely, you really have a fusion of military technology, communication technology, factory engineering with human mind and consciousness with mathematics. And who was that Russian psychologist who first looked at this in terms of psychology? The name is escaping me. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, Luria, right?
Not Luria. No. PK Anokian.
Okay.
So he's talking about it's physiology, right? So the physiology, and so this physiology, and in fact, we'll play a little quote later from in that what do you call it, the seance thing, where this guy, who he obviously a very prominent scientist. I'd like to find out who it is. Obviously, you can tell who Margaret Mead is, and that's a guy. It sounds almost like an old German or Russian or something.
Oh, it is. It's Heinz von Förster. Trying to just. He almost sounds like he's drunk when he speaks. And I've listened to some of his other lectures. He's very hard to listen to, and I really recommend listening to if the audience hasn't. There's a German documentary called The Net. And the guy goes through a lot of these significant players in cybernetics. Of course, it's presented in a way where a lot of connections aren't made. But if you have a discerning eye and ear, you can pick up on some of these things and understand how they all interconnect with one another. And von Förster is comes near the end of the documentary, but really important to listen to.
Yeah. And again, this stuff is quite complex, right? And so this is why we're spending so much time on it. We'll eventually move on to another topic here, but Wiener had that best-selling book, and then it was taken over by this. Initially was not popular in the Soviet Union. Then it was taken over, and then that's one of the reasons that we have the American Society of Cybernetics being basically founded and run by the CIA in the early 60s, right? So we have this AI, we have this idea of artificial intelligence, and this is very much connected with, artificial intelligence as well as, the understanding of the brain itself, neurophysiology, the entire operation of the brain and the human organism. So it really is a vast theory but again, the roots are mechanical machines that will fulfill a purpose and have types of regulative mechanisms. That's how it started. That's where the whole feedback concept comes in. But it goes into the operation of the brain. It goes into the functioning and structure of society. And they're talking about mutating and fusing together homogeneous groups or cultures and using the 5 types of energy, which I'm wondering what that is. And I think that's...
We'll have to look that up.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and take our top of the hour break, and we'll be back. Listen to some music here. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening to Eyes Wide Open, hansutter.com, and hopefully soon a website for this show. Please try to support our work. Shoot me an email, hansutter@hotmail.com. All right. Well, here we go with some music, which is going to start here in the last 10 seconds. So I've got 10 seconds. I don't even know what to do. I've got dead air right now. I'm still talking, still babbling here. 3 seconds. All right. I feel like there's a rocket ship going off. Okay. All right. Friend of mine, of myself, and good friend of mine named Hakan playing oud and doumbek. In that case, I'm playing oud. One of the things I'm going to be moving towards more in this show is looking at positive solutions, because focusing completely on problems and systems of control can start to create a mindset where you feel that there's no way out. And I certainly believe that music is a very important means to expand our emotional, mental, spiritual horizons. So I'm going to play another music clip, and if people are listening, I hope you enjoy it. But this is Indian classical music, so when you listen, relax your mind and just observe what happens when you listen. All right. This is Ustad Amir Khan.
गाने वाले को कम से कम इतना ध्यान रहना चाहिए कि किस अवसर पर क्या गाना चाहिए।
All right, welcome back to Eyes Wide Open. That was Ustad Amir Khan with Bagashi Kanara Soraga, set in Jumra Tal. And before we launch into our topic here, I just wanted to state that music, especially more not necessarily difficult forms of music, but this like Indian classical music and also Western classical music, it can give you access to states. It can actually expand your mind. And actually, in a certain sense, if you listen in a very relaxed manner and just sort of allow the effect of the music, it can actually rewrite or kind of erase types of programming. Now, what's interesting though, if you look at music as sort of a microcosm, of conscious perception, awareness, will, causality, agency, and things like that, right? Because music is set in time and it is an abstract, it's just sound, right? But these abstract organizations reflect not only social organizations, but also mental organization, thought processes, and emotions. So if you think about types of music that are very fixed, for example, the doom, gak, doom, doom, gak, doom, things like that, like techno or things like that, some of this music can actually operate as a type of encoding or conditioning mechanism that ties in with these other types of cybernetic systems. But all right, well, let's dive right back in. Kathy, do you want to let me go ahead and play that that other piece of, and you're going to read another quote from him. So let's just listen to this. I'm going to just stop it after every sentence so I can break it down instead of trying to break the whole thing down at once. So here we go. Okay, so the first statement is behavior is purposeful. We live in a psychological reality. Okay, behavior is purposeful. So purposeful behavior, right? Teleological systems. We live in a psychological reality. So our reality is created by our minds, so to speak. Let's go on. Or life space. So we live in a psychological reality or life space. Okay. And here we have Lewin, right? Lewin. Okay. Continuing. So he's saying that this reality also includes imagined states that do not currently exist. So this is our reality, right? So we have also, okay, let's go on. Sorry. And then it goes back into that with knowledge of conditions that obtain in homogeneous groups. So we have a statement that we live in this space, a life world, a psychological world that includes also imagined states that do not exist yet, but yet they exist. So why don't you read that quote from the same individual? It does sound like he's drunk, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know he's hard to listen to, isn't he? I've listened to quite a bit of him. He says, what I see is that science, or scientia in Latin, has been amazingly successful in the last 2,000 years since Aristotle. There's that 2,000 years again, right? And what does scientia derive from? The Indo-European word for scientia is the word sky. That's how he said sky. And that is found in science and scientia, and in schizophrenia and in schism. That is the meaning of the word to separate. And so systems is a parallel development, only it's the exact opposite of science, for it integrates. When you think about it today, all of the systems theory and systems research, which crops up in both art and science, he says, I wouldn't call that science anymore. I would call it systemics. Today, science has moved on to an approach that sees things together, systemics. And what's interesting, in another video that I watched of his, he basically says that cybernetics is the information functions between machines and living beings, and that there's this assumption that the nervous system doesn't reproduce reality, but it calculates it. And he says that really man is nothing more than an information processing system, and that the brain is no longer the place where ego and identity are mysteriously created by consciousness, but it is a machine consisting of switching and controlling circuits, feedback loops, and communication nodes. that basically the brain is a black box where cause is effect and effect is cause within an infinite cycle, a closed feedback system with input and output that can controlled and calculated.
Wow. Well, why don't you
Really a lot.
break that down a little bit? This stuff you do have to break it down. I mean, it's certainly
You really have to break it down, because you really have to consider the fact that these people really think about human beings as being machines that, we can be programmed, that there's input output, that the mind is like a computer. And it really takes out this element of what you started with today about music. And music's interesting because out of all of the senses, they all go through the reticular activating system with the exception of music, which goes directly to the emotional center.
Yeah, but also see, again, this is why certain types of music are good for studying because it creates an orderly flow of thought. And as I mentioned, I put a lot of terms in there, but you look at agency, you have your potential for action, right? Your potential actions that you can take and also the awareness of them. Because if you have actions you can take and you're not aware of them, you don't really have agency in that area. I mean, it doesn't mean, this is distinct from choice, right? The idea of like proliferating millions of choices. That's not what we're referring to here, right? And let me just draw on this real quick. This is Cybernetics and Counterculture, which is a short PDF. Walker from the Walker Arts Center, Hippie Modernism, The Struggle for Utopia Exhibit Catalog. Okay, so, and this is entitled, it's only like 2 pages, but it's entitled How Cybernetics Connects Computing, Counterculture, and Design with Herbert Drubley and Paul Pangero. Okay. Man is always aiming to achieve some goal, and he's always looking for new goals. Gordon Pask. And I'll read this because this is a very nice overview of what we've been discussing. It's only 1 page, actually. The rest is a chart. So, beginning in the decade before World War II and accelerating through the war and after, scientists designed increasingly sophisticated mechanical and electrical systems that acted as if they had a purpose. This work intersected other work on cognition in animals, as well as early work on computing. What emerged was a new way of looking at systems, not just mechanical and electrical systems, but also biological and social systems. A unifying theory of systems and their relations to their environment. This turn towards whole systems and systems thinking became known as cybernetics. Cybernetics frames the world in terms of systems and their goal. This approach led to unexpected outcomes. Systems achieve goals through iterative processes or feedback loops. Suddenly, serious scientists were talking seriously about circular causality. A causes B, and B causes C, and C causes A. Looking more closely, scientists saw the difficulty of separating the observer from the system. Indeed, the system appeared to be a construction of the observer. The role of the observer is to provide a description of the system which is provided to another observer. The description requires language, and the process of observing, creating language, and sharing descriptions creates a society. Let me just stop right there. So the role of the observer is to provide a description of the system. Okay, so the observer is describing, say a social system.
This goes all into conversation. As I listen to this, it's really challenging for me because it goes into the entire thing on coaching, and it's all based on conversation theory. And it goes back to that conversations that we read with Pangaro a few weeks ago on can we ever really understand anything in the word cup? And they're purporting to say that this discourse that they're promoting on conversation theory and breaking this down helps to increase understanding, but it's really obfuscating understanding.
Yeah. Well, let me just finish breaking down that paragraph. So indeed, the system appeared to be a construction of the observer. Okay, the role of the observer is to provide a description of the system, which is provided to another observer. Okay, so we have an observer. The system is constructed by the observer, and then this is provided to another observer. The description requires language. Okay, so we have the importance of language. You're describing a system, and notice the observer. So it's very interesting to notice the position of the observer is somehow in a certain way by taking the stance of observation, the observer constructs the system, even creates the system. And okay, going on, this description requires language, and the process of observing, creating language, and sharing descriptions creates a society. So society is formed by this process of observing and sharing descriptions. Now, is it creating a society or is it manipulating? We'll see. Okay, and then suddenly serious scientists were talking seriously about subjectivity. And notice also in this language, you have serious scientists were talking seriously. Okay, it's a little bit odd.
Is that really what they say?
Yeah,
Serious
serious
okay.
scientists were talking seriously about subjectivity, about language, conversation, and ethics, and their relation to system and design. Serious scientists were beginning to study collaboration. This turn away from the mainstream of science became a turn towards interdisciplinarity, and towards counterculture. Two of these scientists, Heinz von Forster and Gordon Pask, took an interest in design even as design was absorbing the lessons of cybernetics. Another member of the group, Gregory Bateson, caught the attention of Stuart Brand, systems thinker, designer, and publisher of the Whole Earth Catalog. Bateson introduced Brand to von Forster. Brand's Whole Earth Catalog spawned a do-it-yourself publishing revolution, including Forster's 500-page The Cybernetics of Cybernetics, futurist Ted Nelson's Computer Lib Dream Machines, and designers Don Korberg and Jim Bagnall's Universal Traveler, a soft systems guide to creativity, problem solving, and the process of reaching goals, as well as several other books about design. In addition to being icons of counterculture, these also early printed examples of hypertext, a term coined by Nelson. In a sense, they anticipate the interconnectedness of the World Wide Web. Nelson's work on hypertext intersects past work on conversation theory and lay foundations for the future of human-computer interaction. Okay, now what's interesting is we have this really nice chart with all the different organizations and what people are connected with, right? So starting on the left, we have MIT, Vanguard Bush, Julian Bigelow, Arthur Rosenblum, Bertrand Russell, J. Wilbert Gibbs, James Clerk Maxwell, and they connect with the big names Norbert Wiener, Hans von Forster, John von Neumann, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson. Now let's look at some of these connections. So Bateson is connected with R.D. Lang, who's connected with Humberto Maturno, who is connected with Stuart Brand. And there's a lot of these points go to Stuart Brand, Mary Pranksters, Ken Kesey, Timothy Leary, Gene Youngblood, UC Berkeley, Soft Systems. Okay, so this is all connected. Francis Varley, so Gene Youngblood, so all these, Ken Kesey is tied into Stuart Brand, into Timothy Leary as an intersection of these things, which also ties in the University of Utah, founder of Adobe, founder of Netscape. Sorry for not being very cogent here. And also this ties into, we have Gray Walter, who is tied into William S. Burroughs. We have Marshall McLuhan, right? Buckminster Fuller. So all these people are tied together. We have countercultural leaders listed here. We have Brian Eno, William S. Burroughs, Marshall McLuhan. We have Stuart Brand, Mary Pranksters, Timothy Leary, Gene Youngblood. Okay, and so all these things, this goes directly to Google. So we have direct connection between Google, IIT Institute of Design, Design Thinking, UC Berkeley, Brunel University, etc. Apple, in the design of the internet, the ARPANET. So all this stuff came directly out of this, right? And so I don't actually know, Gray Walter, who's tied in with Ross Ashby, Gordon Pask, tied in with me. I'll try to, unfortunately.
Well, they're all participants of the Macy conferences too. So all those names are very familiar and they all play different roles during different conferences.
Yeah, but I'm saying that this ties directly into the counterculture, right? Which is interesting. And this
Absolutely. Well, because the counterculture came from this. See, it's like people focus so much on like MK Ultra birthing the counterculture, but probably the genesis of all of it is the cybernetics, right?
Yeah. Just the annoying thing with this PDF is that it cuts off in the, you have to draw.
It's online too. So if you look at Pangaro's website. I've come across that before when I was doing research on design theory, and then realized that design theory and innovation is really cybernetics. And that ties in with conversation theory. They all come in together, which ties into the whole notion of what we call emotional intelligence. So all of these things come in together.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is this whole notion of creativity ties in with what Bateson spoke about, which is schizophrenia. And then going back into what Heinz von Förster was speaking about in that interview, where he talks about the word science coming from sky, which means, of course, schism is important because that ties into Bateson's work as schizogenesis, schismogenesis. I forgot how it says. How do you say that?
Schismogenesis. Yeah, schismogenesis. Yep.
And, it ties into schizophrenia, and it ties into split and separating. And so that really seems like it's an important thing. And you think about what is LSD, but a schizophrenogen, right? And then you tie into what you were talking about before, Silicon Valley, and all of the promotion again about microdosing with LSD. It seems like there's just such a big push to create split personalities, because split personalities are probably going to be easier to manipulate, especially personalities of where people don't even understand what their gender is anymore. It makes me wonder, at least I started thinking about it today. What's the connection between this utopia that's supposed to be being created through cybernetics and transgenderism? When there's no differentiation anymore between the sexes, there's no differentiation anymore between having a body and consciousness. It reminds me of Fred Turner's work from on the counterculture, where he talks about creating disembodied communities of consciousness. I mean, really, what does it mean? It's mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, I think we're starting to get a sense of it. Hopefully people are interested, because there's a whole bunch of other material, but I'm trying to go a bit slow into this, and even, we kind of backtrack, but that's also how you gain an understanding, because it is very complex. And let me just pull a little bit more out of this, right? So we're looking at the way matter and energy, information age, and cybernetics focuses on the use of feedback to correct errors and attain goals. It has roots in neurobiology and found practical application during World War II in the development of automatic controls for piloting ships, airplanes, and artillery shells. Okay, but here's the thing to keep in mind too. We look at have you seen the videos of people with shell shock in World War I? I mean, and the horrific injuries that happened in World War I. People forget about that. It does also go back, it does connect to a certain extent with the Tavistock Institute and the understanding.
Not a certain extent, no, a big extent, because shell shock ties in with Jonathan Rawling Rees, and it ties in with Brock Chisholm, and Brock Chisholm is a really important character in all of this, because he also speaks about he was speaking about basically basic universal income and what we're experiencing today back in the 1930s. So this makes a lot of sense. In fact, it was the study of shell-shocked soldiers that led to a lot of this, with the work of Jonathan Rawling Rees, Brock Chisholm, John Bowlby. It was very important for the work that then turned into the Macy conferences and cerebral inhibition.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me just read a little bit more here. So Wiener, I know, yeah, used cybernetics to describe a new science, and so he did coin the term cybernetics. Okay, that combines under one heading the study of what in a human context is sometimes loosely described as thinking, and in engineering is known as control and communication. In other words, cybernetics attempts to find common elements in the functioning of automatic machines and of the human nervous system, and to develop a theory which will cover the entire field. There was no existing word for this complex of ideas. I felt constrained to invent one, hence cybernetics, which I derived from the Greek word kubernetes, or steersman, the same Greek word from which we get our word governor. Okay, so governors, the governor, they're saying that the head of state is very similar to a thermostat, right? The correcting cruise control, and there's various examples. So that's, now we go on. When I communicate with another person, I impart a message to him. And when he communicates back with me, as he returns a related message which contains information primarily accessible to him and not to me. When I give an order to a machine, the situation is not essentially different from that which arises when I give an order to a person. In other words, as far as my consciousness goes, I am aware of the order that has gone out and the signal compliance that has come back. To me personally, the fact that the signal in its intermediate stages has gone through a machine rather than through a person is irrelevant and does not cause great change in my relation to the signal. Thus, the theory of control and engineering, whether human, animal, or mechanical, is a chapter in the theory of messages. Okay, so notice, so when we look at that, so we have this communication, I communicate, and he communicates a related message, information primarily accessible to him. When I give an order to a machine, it's not different from when I give an order to a person. As far as my consciousness goes, I'm aware of the order and the signal that compliance has come back. So in the intermediate stages gone through a machine rather than a person does not change my relation to the signal. So it's a sending messages, receiving, sending, and controlling messages. Now, the question is this. Now, we receive messages, certainly, but I wonder to what extent, again, as we've been sort of going around on this quite a bit, is that what extent is this simply a means to describe the means of biologically, psychologically controlling and issuing orders as opposed to just modeling, right? So I think there could be an extent of where this model of cybernetics is imposed on human beings, therefore constructing them as functioning within the cybernetic system, right? So this system, you look at the observer, he's creating the system. So they're saying that by observing society in this way, we're actually changing and creating and manipulating and fusing and mutating social systems.
Well, it makes a lot of sense because you have to realize too that Brock Chisholm was very involved in the World Health Organization and with mental health standards. And he had some very interesting thoughts about all this. See, all of these things, streams come together. All of these people, they're all interconnected or in different ways. And so like, here's something that is attributed to Brock Chisholm. He did a lot of the studies on shell shock, and it'd be interesting. It's interesting how many of the same themes keep coming through. He said he felt that a world police force prepared, and this is his quote, prepared to suppress ruthlessly without parley or negotiation any appeal to force by any people in the world is desirable. He also advocates a redistribution of wealth so all people in the world can live approximately at the same economic level. In addition, he feels that psychiatric education for all people who show any neurotic tendencies, which are the primary cause of war, is a necessity. He says, if the race is to be freed from its crippling burden of good and evil, it must be psychiatrists who take the original responsibility. Dr. Chisholm prophesies that in perhaps 20 years, we might be able to change the dearest certainties of the human race, to root out and destroy the oldest and most flourishing parasitical growth in the world, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Wow. So that's important. Let's come back to that in a second.
I mean, we didn't really, as we should say too, we didn't prepare a lot today because we had these different things, and like you're picking up things, and now that reminded me of something that I was reading, and it just seems like all of these streams are coming together, and it starting to, create something very meaningful here.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that quote. I want you actually to go over it again, but let me finish. This is a quote from Margaret Mead. So by 1968, Margaret Mead was contemplating the application of cybernetics to social problems, and probably before then. Okay, but that's what they're saying here. And this is a quote from Mead: "As the world scene broadens, there is a continuing possibility of using cybernetics as a form of communication in a world of increasing scientific specialization." Okay, as the world scene broadens, there is continuing possibility. So it's kind of, used as a form of communication. We ought to look very seriously at the current state of American society, within which we hope to be able to develop these very sophisticated ways of handling systems that are indeed in dire need of attention. Problems of metropolitan areas, the interrelationships between different levels of government, the redistribution of income, the linkages necessary among parts of large industrial complexes. So Okay, notice this metropolitan areas. She's redistribution of income. Well, that's Communist Manifesto, but let's go on. Okay, at heart, though, there may have been the promise of an even grander purpose. Gregory Bateson, Meade's first husband, reported that actually that's incorrect, right? It was Meade's second husband.
No, it was her third husband. Her first husband was Luther Cressman. Her second husband was Rio Fortune. And her third husband was Gregory Bateson. Yeah, and all the while so her first husband she married in 23. And then her second husband she married in 28. And then through all three husbands, she was having an affair with Ruth Benedict. So she was in a lesbian love affair with Ruth Benedict during the entire time. She says she had 3 open marriages.
Yeah. Okay. So let me finish here. And then, so at heart, okay, there may have been the promise of even grander purpose. Gregory Bateson, Meade's first husband, which of course, interesting that they didn't need to say Meade's husband. Why they put that incorrect thing that's commonly known. But anyways, reported that what excited him about the early discussions of cybernetics was that, quote, it was a solution to the problem of purpose. From Aristotle on, the final cause has always been the mystery. We didn't realize it then, at least I didn't, though Macy Conference Chair McCullough might have, that the whole world of logic would have to be reconstructed for recursiveness. So what we have there, the problem of purpose, the purpose of the world, the first cause, God, the universe, right? It's the ultimate solution to every question, right? It's like the ultimate answer to everything from spiritual to material. Then he again, what these guys always tend to do is make these big statements and then kind of break it down to, logic, the whole of logic. So you have to reconstruct logic for recursiveness. So logic can have these embedded circular systems within logic. We'll just go on here. So we have second order cybernetics. Heinz von Forster, okay, is that on the notes for the Macy conferences. He said that revolving about these concepts was communication about communication. The problem of communication and of self-integrating mechanisms. So, okay, and then we go on. And there was a Society for General Systems Theory. Why can't we look at this society systematically as a system? Why do they always repeat these words, right? But so Meade, in 1955, meeting of this general, at a meeting for Society for General Systems Theory, quote, I suggested that instead of founding just another society, they give little thought to how they could use their theory to predict the kind and size of society they wanted, what its laws of growth and articulation with other parts of the scientific community should be. Now, we can also expand that to the system of not just this particular society, of this Society for General Systems Theory, which is an academic, an intellectual society or a group. But she's, look at that. What do you apply that to society itself? The growth of society, the size and kind of society. Notice depopulation, Agenda 21, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are directly outgrowths of this stuff. And could you maybe go back over that quote that you read previously? Because that was quite interesting.
Right. Dr. Chisholm feels that a world police force prepared to suppress ruthlessly without parley or negotiation any appeal to force by people in the world is desirable. And this is the part. He advocates a redistribution of wealth so all people in the world can live at approximately the same economic level. In addition, he feels that psychiatric education for all people who show any neurotic tendencies, which is the primary cause of war, is a necessity. If the race is to be freed from its crippling burden of good and evil, it must be psychiatrists who take the original responsibility. We should begin to teach psychology in the first year of school at about 5 or 6 years of age, before their ability to think has been entirely spoiled. Dr. Chisholm prophesies that in perhaps 20 years we might be able to change the dear certainties of the human race, to root out and destroy the oldest and most flourishing parasitical growth in the world, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
That is just wild, is it not? Because they talk about the fruit of the tree and they're cutting that down. And it's a very powerful statement, but good and evil. So, this is the one world government. This is the Communist Manifesto time on steroids. It's even something very different from that. Okay, let me just go.
And using psychiatry to shape, wait a minute. Well, I can't believe I said that. I was just going to say using psychiatry to shape war, but there's actually an article by Jonathan Rawling Rees that says shaping society through psychiatry.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, okay, let's look at Matorno. So Matorno, the Chilean biologist, right? So he says, his article Meta Design, Matorno says, we human beings exist as such in language. That is, we exist in the flow of living together in the recursive coordinations of behavior that language is. I call the consensual braiding of language and emotions conversation. Now, what does recursive mean? So recursive is something it's repetitive, it's something that goes back, but it also relates to the repeated application of a rule to achieve successive results. So you keep applying the same rule and you keep achieving similar results, like you're processing something. And in computing, it relating to or involving a program or a routine of which a part requires the application of the whole, so that is explicit interpretation requires in general many successive executions. So execution of the program. So it's a routine of which a part requires the application of the whole. So you have a small part that's being a system that's being run through a much larger program, but as it's almost like it has its own momentum, and eventually it eventually, produces a result, but it's like a smaller, like a subroutine set up inside of the larger society. So he's talking about, obviously, about conversation theory.
I just have to stop
Absolutely.
right now, because I'm like, ooh, I can't believe all this. It's like, this is like what my career's been based on. And it's like, I had no idea. I went to this ontological coaching site. And so, okay, Maturana is really important, the man that you're speaking about, because remember, Stafford Beer went down to Chile and worked with Allende, right, to bring in a cybernetic model. They called it Project Cybersun. And I was always wondering, like, why in the executive coaching world are there so many Chileans involved, like Fernando Flores, Ayaya, Maturana, and I forgot one other guy. And I'm looking at this right now, and I'm on their website, and it says, Humberto Maturana is a biologist who specializes in the area of cognition. His life's work has been the development of a new interpretation of what it is to be cognitive. This interpretation has been the key to seeing human beings as human observers who rather than just seeing what exists independent of themselves, constantly change their own structure and dance with their environment. Being social creatures, this environment includes other human beings. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah. And so as we go on, Matona extends it. So we human beings can do whatever we imagine, but we do not have to do all that we imagine. We can choose. And it is there where our behavior as socially conscious human beings matters. We are responsible for the world in which we live. We are responsible for the world we design. So
but who's designing it and who's responsible? See, it goes back into like all of these things that they've been talking about, like, where do the goals come from? How influenced are we by goals that we're not even aware of, that we adopt as our own? The language is so leading. It's like when you were talking to me a couple of weeks ago about that Conversations article that we read from Cybernetics and Conversation. It ties back to these same things. There's already assumptions embedded in the language that as I'm listening to you read this, it's like I'm just thinking to myself, all of the assumptions that are embedded, that I have to agree basically with what's happening in order for what you're saying to make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, let's just go on. So we look at, you have the Center for the Biologic Computing Laboratory, Biological Computing Laboratory, University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. We have von Forster. Cybernetics.
University of Illinois is huge because this is where a lot of Common Core came from, and this is where University of Illinois people, and this is where is it Bond? Remember you were talking about designing society 3 weeks ago?
Yeah. Yep.
That's where this comes from too. University of Illinois. So I mean, I'm just trying to make connections.
Yeah. No, let me just. Yeah, I'll try to finish up here. So BCL conducted research in cybernetics, system theory, bionics, parallel computing, neurophysiology, biologic, artificial intelligence, symbolic computing, and self-organizing systems. Now, Shannon's work, this is Claude Shannon, which came up with basic computer architecture. Shannon's master's thesis showed how Boolean logic, the binary positing of all values is either true or false, could be embodied in switches, and laid the groundwork for digital computers. And then, Shannon supervised Evan Sutherland, who resulted in Sketchpad. And Sketchpad, they also described something called the Dynabook, a portable computer tablet for children's all ages. Children of all ages, that your iPad, right? So this is 1972. So children of all ages, the Dynabook, which is an interesting name. And then Stanford's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, Kay became friends with Stuart Brand, went on to work at Xerox, PARC, and Apple. And so he talks about computer-man symbiosis. This is Licklider. Computer man symbiosis. It would involve very close coupling between the human and the electronic members of the partnership. The main aims are to, one, let computers facilitate formulative thinking. Formulative, that is formula, but also formulative thinking created by computers that formulate our whole idea of the world and social structure. That's my side, right? And two, to enable men and computers to cooperate in making decisions and controlling complex situations. So why does man need to interact with a computer? I mean, why the computer has to make these decisions? I mean, you're not talking just about a machine, right, that's doing assessment, or something like that, but you're talking about actually man is almost below the computer and is cooperating with the computer. The computer is, in a sense, making these decisions. Okay, we'll go on. 1968, Lidlecker published The Computer as Communication Device. The first sentence sets the tone. Quote, in a few years, men will be able to communicate more effectively through a machine than face to face.
You can see this goes back to the whole premise that they believe that human beings are flawed and that machines are accurate. It goes back into that Turing test where people were communicating with a person and a computer, and they had to guess which one was the person and which was the computer. And then further, they did tests, Turing did, where you had to guess if you were communicating with a male or a female. And if you couldn't tell, then the machine's smarter than you are, right? The machine, you're absolutely right. You really nailed something that is very foundational to their belief, is that the machine is superior to the human.
Yeah. And then we go on with the countercultural connection, right? We have, so a very important thing is this, that there's no more values, right? Notice you're cutting the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's no more good and evil. So cybernetics opens up what they call inframed culture, this is why it just goes absolutely, we won't get into Heidegger, that's a whole other topic, but so they basically argue, so cybernetics challenges conventional dualism between mind and matter. Psychology can spill into engineering, and vice versa. So cybernetics is open to revolution and possibility. And Brand came to appreciate the Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth Catalog, major figure in a counterculture, right? So Bateson came to appreciate cybernetics as an intellectual framework and as a social practice. He associated both with alternative forms of communal organization. So Brand traveled between and connected several communities: cybernetics, Bateson, Mead, von Forster; computing, Engelbert K. Nelson and Negroponte; and of course, counterculture. Ken Kesey, the Merry Pranksters, and Annie and other communards. John Markoff has chronicled how the 60s counterculture shaped the, LSD in Silicon Valley.
So we're getting a lot. We have a lot. Can we just stop for a minute? Because I'm kind of getting lost right now. We've just been dumped a ton of information, but what's the value of all of this? What does it mean?
Yeah, just one thing real quick. Brand introduction to Bohemian culture began earlier when he was in the Army working as a, quote, military photographer. On his time off, he got to know the New York art scene and became involved with the USCO. So he's a military photographer. How's he getting involved? Anyways, so again, you see this. We'll stop there. We are kind of... Actually, you know what, Kathy? We have 4 minutes left. So why don't you go ahead and give your clothing? Your oh my God!
Excuse me.
Sorry, your
how about I'll give my clothes?
Your closing statement. You got 3 minutes.
I think that we really need to listen a little bit more to what we talked about today, because we did a really big dump of data, and then next week break it down and not add in more information, because I think that it's interesting to bring this stuff forth, but then to help to break it down and to get meaning. Because one thing that's really, I think, very helpful, and I know it's helpful for myself, is that having somebody else to speak to, or having other people make comments about things and bring in their own perspectives, helps me to more deeply understand something. And I think that's really the value of this, is that there really aren't a lot of people talking about this or who have spoken about it. How does it relate to what's happening in the world today and ourselves, such that we're not just bobbing along and, going wherever the environment's shaping us to go, but that we're not just being purposeful, but we're adding meaning to it and understanding what we're doing. So I'd really like to see that, I'd like to really focus on that next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, sure, Kathy, thanks for being with me. We may even bring some guests on, so it's not just me rambling away here in my high castle where I survey the world. But and we've seen, what we're doing is we're kind of circling back, but in order to grasp the subject, I think you really have to, because it's extremely complex, and with the very heavy overlay of science and mathematics. And notice these other goals, right? These other goals of restructuring, reordering society, but also some of these quotes from the early 60s, even the 50s, where man will communicate better via machines than they will face to face. You can see the iPad, in the early 70s, they're talking about a book for children of all ages. That means us. That means grown adults who are still like little kids, right? The Dyna book. So we have these things that are absolutely reflected in our world today. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening, and we'll be back next week. My website is hansutter.com. I will update it. Any support is appreciated. Also, even just let me know you're listening, hans@hansutter.com, and etc. So, and if you do want to support, maybe pick up one of my CDs or whatever. So I'm not thrown out on the street by the cybernetic monsters. No, not so bad. But anyways, again, thanks everybody for listening, and I hope everyone just has a wonderful rest of their week. All right. Good night, everybody. And
Good night.
We'll see you soon. By the way, I saw the Walton's Farm. We can talk about that next week. Kind of interesting, but okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Hans. All right.